Hey everyone, and welcome back. Today we're taking a deep dive into something that affects us all pretty directly. Fiscal policy.
It really does.
Might sound a little dry at first, but trust me,
Yeah.
we'll make it interesting. And by the end, you'll have a much better understanding of how those government decisions about taxes and spending
Right.
actually impact your daily life.
Exactly.
Oh,
It's about your money
yeah, where?
and the government's decisions.
Does the government even get all its money?
Well, it's kind of like a household budget, just on a much larger scale. The government has two main sources of income.
Okay,
Current revenue, which is the steady flow of money coming in,
okay.
and then capital revenue, which is more like one-off or infrequent windfalls.
Okay, so current revenue would be things like income tax from our paychecks,
Exactly.
VAT on those online shopping sprees,
yeah.
and maybe even a lucky lottery win.
Yeah, exactly. Those everyday sources that keep the government running. And then you have capital revenue, which could be anything from selling off state-owned assets to
Okay.
even borrowing money on the bond market.
So that's like selling that old guitar on eBay
Yeah,
or taking out a mortgage.
exactly.
Okay, so the government has its money now. How does it spend it all?
Just like with revenue, there are two categories:
Okay.
current and capital expenditure.
Okay.
Current expenditure covers the essentials, things like salaries for teachers and nurses, social welfare payments, the day-to-day running of all those government departments.
So keeping the lights on and the wheels turning?
Exactly.
What about capital expenditure?
This is where we invest in the future.
Okay.
Big projects, building new schools and hospitals, upgrading our transport networks,
Yeah.
all those long-term investments
Yeah.
that really shape the country's landscape.
Like that new motorway I've been enjoying.
Exactly. That's a capital expenditure.
Wow. So these things are happening all around us, and we don't even realize how much it all costs. So how does the government keep track of all this income and spending?
Well, that's where the budget comes in.
Okay.
It's essentially a plan that outlines the government's expected revenue and expenditure
Okay.
for a specific period, usually a year.
Okay. Within that budget, there's some terms we really need to understand.
Yes.
One that I've always found a little confusing is the exchequer balance.
It's actually simpler than it sounds.
Okay.
It's just the difference between the government's total revenue and its total expenditure.
Okay.
If revenue is higher than expenditure, we have a surplus.
Okay.
If expenditure is higher than revenue, we have a deficit.
So that's like checking your bank balance at the end of the month.
Exactly.
Just on a national scale.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets a little more interesting.
Yes.
Budgets aren't always about simply balancing the books. Sometimes the government wants to actively influence the economy.
Yeah, that's where fiscal policy comes in.
Okay.
The government can use its budget to stimulate the economy or cool things down depending on what's happening.
Okay, so if the economy is in a slump with high unemployment and low growth,
Yeah.
the government might step in with what's called an
Yeah.
expansionary fiscal policy.
Exactly. They could increase spending or cut taxes to boost consumer spending and get things moving again.
And what if things are getting a little too heated with inflation rising rapidly?
Well, then they might apply the brakes with what we call a contractionary fiscal policy.
Okay.
This could involve raising taxes or reducing government expenditures.
Okay, so it's like the government's driving a car and constantly adjusting the speed
Yeah.
and direction
Yeah.
to try and keep the economy on track.
Yeah, good analogy.
But who decides which way to steer the wheel?
Well, in theory, the government of the day has the power to set fiscal policy.
Okay.
But in reality, there are lots of factors at play.
Sure.
Economic forecasts, political pressures,
Yeah.
and even international agreements.
Okay, speaking of international agreements, how does being part of the EU and the Eurozone affect Ireland's fiscal policy?
It adds a whole other layer of complexity.
Right.
EU membership means Ireland has to play by certain rules, particularly when it comes to government borrowing and spending.
Okay.
There are limits on how much of a deficit a country can run,
Right.
what its overall debt levels can be.
So Ireland can't just go on a spending spree
Exactly.
without considering the wider European context.
Yeah, and then you have the European Commission, which keeps a close eye on member states' economies.
Okay.
They can issue recommendations or even impose sanctions if a country isn't playing by the rules.
It's like trying to dance a jig while staying within the lines of a very strict dance floor.
Yeah, I like that.
But let's not forget, the government isn't just trying to balance the books or appease the EU. They have a whole set of economic objectives.
Yeah, they do.
They're aiming for.
They're like the government's wish list.
Okay, so what's on that wish list?
Well, Top of the list is usually full employment.
Okay.
They want to see as many people as possible who want a job actually have one. Then there's economic growth. Nobody wants a stagnant economy.
Right.
So the government's always looking for ways to boost GDP and create more wealth.
And of course, we can't forget about price stability.
Yeah, runaway inflation is nobody's friend.
Right.
They aim to keep inflation low and predictable,
Okay.
which helps maintain purchasing power and encourages investment.
What about things like infrastructure and social programs?
Those are definitely on the list as well, investing in things like transportation, energy, and communications networks.
Yeah.
That's all crucial for supporting economic growth and improving quality of life.
Yeah.
And social programs like healthcare, education, and social welfare
Yeah.
help to ensure a fairer and more equitable society.
So the government has this big wish list of economic objectives.
They do.
How do they actually go about achieving them?
Well, one of the most powerful tools is the one we've already been discussing.
Okay.
Fiscal policy.
Right.
By adjusting taxes and spending, the government can try to influence the overall direction of the economy.
So it's like having a set of levers and dials. They can adjust to fine-tune the economic engine.
Exactly.
But fiscal policy isn't the only tool in the box, is it?
No, the government can also influence the economy through things like regulation, direct intervention in certain sectors,
Okay.
and policies aimed at promoting regional development.
Sounds like a pretty complex process.
It is.
With a lot of moving parts to keep track of.
It is complex.
But understanding these basic principles of fiscal policy
Yeah.
can really help us make sense of the government's actions
Absolutely.
and engage in more informed discussions about the challenges
Yeah,
facing our country.
definitely.
Now let's get down to the nitty-gritty taxes.
Everyone's favorite topic.
They're the primary way the government funds all those programs and services we've been talking about.
Yes. Taxes are like the fuel that powers the government machine.
Okay. And just like with fuel, there are different types with different properties and impacts.
That's right.
So let's break it down. We've got direct taxes and indirect taxes. What's the difference?
Direct taxes are levied directly on income and wealth.
Okay.
So these are the taxes that are deducted from your paycheck,
Okay.
like PAYE, or levied on your investments, like dirt tax.
Okay.
They also include things like capital gains tax on profits from selling assets, inheritance tax,
Okay.
and corporation tax on company profits.
So these are the taxes we see most directly coming out of our pockets or our bank accounts.
Yeah.
What about indirect taxes?
Indirect taxes are levied on goods and services.
Okay.
These are the taxes that are included in the price of the things we buy.
All right.
The most familiar example is VAT,
Right.
which is added to most goods and services.
Always see that extra line on my receipts.
Exactly.
Never my favorite part.
And then there are excise duties,
Okay.
which are slapped on things like alcohol, tobacco, and fuel.
Okay.
Tariffs are another type of indirect tax applied to imported goods to protect domestic industries.
Okay.
And don't forget stamp duty, which is charged on certain transactions, like buying a house.
So many different ways to collect revenue.
There are.
But it's not just about how much the government collects. It's also about how those taxes are structured
Yes.
and who ends up bearing the burden.
Yeah, that's where the concepts of progressive and regressive taxes come in.
Okay.
A progressive tax takes a larger percentage of income from high-income earners than from low-income earners.
Okay, so a good example of this is our income tax system,
Yes.
where those who earn more
Yeah,
pay a higher tax rate.
exactly. This is the idea of ability to pay.
Okay, what about regressive taxes?
A regressive tax takes a larger percentage of income from low-income earners.
Okay.
So an example would be the TV license fee,
Right.
which is a flat fee that everyone pays,
Okay.
regardless of income.
It seems like finding the right balance between these different types of taxes is crucial for creating a fair and equitable tax system.
It is.
But it's not always that straightforward, is it?
No, it's not.
Yeah.
There are always trade-offs to consider.
Well-
A highly progressive tax system might seem fair in principle, but it could disincentivize work and investment
Okay.
if high earners feel like they're being penalized.
Right.
On the other hand, relying too heavily on regressive taxes can exacerbate inequality
Right.
and place a disproportionate burden on lower-income households.
It's a delicate balancing act.
But it is.
But speaking of balance,
Bleh.
let's shift our focus to the government's budget.
Okay.
That all-important document that outlines its planned revenue and expenditure.
Think of it as a roadmap for how it intends to manage the nation's finances over a specific period.
Right.
It's a detailed plan that sets out how much revenue the government expects to collect
Right.
and how it plans to spend that money.
And we've already touched on the two main components of the budget.
Yes.
Current spending, which covers day-to-day expenses,
Yeah.
and capital spending, which focuses on long-term investments.
Exactly. The current budget is about keeping the wheels turning,
Right.
funding essential services, paying public sector salaries, providing social welfare support. The capital budget, on the other hand, is about investing in the future,
Okay.
building infrastructure, laying the foundation for long-term economic growth.
Okay, now when we talk about budget deficits and surpluses, are we talking about the overall budget
hmm
or just the current spending side of things?
When we talk about deficits and surpluses,
Okay.
we're generally referring to the current budget.
Okay.
A deficit means the government is spending more on its day-to-day operations than it's taking in
Okay.
through revenue.
Okay.
A surplus means it's taking in more than it's spending.
So what are the implications of running a budget deficit? Is it always a bad thing?
Well, a deficit isn't necessarily a cause for alarm, especially if it's temporary,
Okay.
and used to finance investments that will boost the economy in the long run.
Hmm.
For example, borrowing to invest in infrastructure projects during a recession
Right.
can create jobs and stimulate economic activity,
Why?
helping to generate future revenue that can be used to repay the debt.
So strategic borrowing can actually be a good thing, as long as it's done responsibly with a clear plan for repayment.
Exactly.
But what about if the government consistently runs deficits year after year?
Well, if deficits become chronic
Yeah.
and debt levels rise too high,
Okay.
it can start to create problems.
Right.
A large national debt can burden future generations with interest payments,
Yeah.
limit the government's ability to respond to future challenges,
Okay.
and even damage the country's credit rating, making it more expensive to borrow in the future.
It's like maxing out your credit cards and then struggling to make the minimum payments each month. Eventually, it catches up with you.
Exactly.
So finding the right balance between using borrowing strategically to stimulate the economy
Yeah.
and keeping debt levels under control
Yes.
is crucial for long-term economic stability.
Absolutely.
Speaking of the national debt, it's a topic that often dominates the headlines and political debates.
It does.
But it can be a little confusing to understand exactly what it is
Yeah.
and how it works.
The national debt is essentially the total amount of money the government owes to its creditors.
Okay.
It's accumulated over time as the government borrows money to cover budget deficits.
So when the government spends more than it takes in through taxes and other revenue sources,
Mm,
it has to borrow money to make up the difference.
right.
And that borrowed money adds to the national debt.
Exactly.
Now, the size of the national debt can be a bit daunting.
It can.
In Ireland's case, it currently stands at over 203 billion.
It's a lot.
That's a lot of zeros.
Yeah.
How do we even begin to grasp a number that large?
Well, it's helpful to look at the debt to GDP ratio,
Okay.
which measures the national debt as a percentage of the country's gross domestic product.
Okay, so it's like comparing your personal debt to your annual income. If your debt is much larger than your income,
Yeah,
you're likely to face more challenges in managing that debt.
exactly.
Now, Ireland's debt to GDP ratio has fluctuated over the years.
It has.
Back in the early 1990s, it was around 90%, thanks to a period of rapid economic growth. It fell to a low of 27.6% by 2005.
Right.
But then the financial crisis hit,
And everything changed.
and everything changed.
Yeah,
So managing this debt is a key responsibility of the government.
it is.
But how do they actually do that? Where do they go to borrow all this money?
The government borrows money through the bond market.
Okay.
They issue bonds,
Okay.
which are essentially IOUs,
Okay.
that promise to repay the principal plus interest at a future date.
Okay, so investors buy these bonds, effectively lending money to the government.
Exactly.
But those investors aren't just doing it out of the goodness of their hearts, are they?
No, they're looking for a return on their investment.
Right.
The interest rate on those bonds,
Okay.
known as the yield,
Okay.
reflects investors' perceptions of the risk associated with lending to the government.
Okay.
If investors perceive the government as a risky borrower,
Right.
they'll demand a higher yield,
Okay.
meaning the government has to pay more in interest.
So it's in the government's best interest to maintain a good credit rating.
It is.
Just like individuals need a good credit score to get favorable loan terms.
Exactly.
And the state of the economy plays a big role in determining bond yields.
It does. If the economy is strong and investors have confidence in the government's ability to repay its debts,
Right.
yields will be lower.
Okay. But if the economy is weak
Yeah.
and investors are worried about the government's finances,
Then yields will be higher,
okay.
making it more expensive for the government to borrow.
It's a fascinating, albeit complex system.
Yeah, but I think we're starting to get a better grasp of how the government's borrowing and spending activities impact the economy as a whole.
And don't forget, those impacts ultimately trickle down to us.
They do.
The citizens, they affect our taxes, the quality of public services, and even our job prospects.
That's right. Fiscal policy isn't just some abstract concept. It has very real consequences for our lives.
Absolutely. And speaking of real consequences,
Okay.
Let's talk about privatization.
Another hot button issue.
Another hot button issue that often sparks heated debates.
Yeah.
Privatization essentially means selling off government-owned assets, like state-owned enterprises, to private investors.
Yeah, it's a strategy that has been employed in Ireland and many other countries around the world with varying degrees of success and controversy.
So let's dive into those arguments.
Okay.
What are the main reasons why a government might choose to privatize a state-owned enterprise?
One of the most common arguments is that private companies are simply more efficient than state-owned enterprises.
Okay.
They're driven by the profit motive.
Right.
So they have a stronger incentive to cut costs, improve productivity, and innovate.
It's like the idea that competition breeds efficiency. If a company has to compete in the marketplace, it's more likely to strive for excellence and provide better value for money. Another argument is that private companies often have better access to capital than state-owned enterprises.
They do.
They can raise money from investors more easily, allowing them to invest in new technologies, expand their operations, and compete more effectively on a global scale.
Exactly.
So privatization can be seen as a way to inject much-needed capital into a struggling industry or a company that's falling behind its competitors.
Yeah. And the sale of a state-owned asset can also provide a significant cash injection for the government.
Okay, it's like selling your old car to raise money for a down payment on a house.
Exactly.
But of course, privatization isn't without its critics.
No.
What are some of the main concerns people raise about privatization?
One of the biggest concerns is that the government might sell off profitable companies, losing out on future revenue streams.
Right, so if a state-owned enterprise is generating a healthy profit, selling it to a private investor means giving up that future income.
It's like selling a goose that lays golden eggs.
You get a lump sum of money now, but you lose out on a steady stream of income in the future.
Exactly.
And it can also be difficult to sell inefficient companies.
It can.
If a state-owned enterprise is poorly managed and burdened with debt, it might be hard to find a buyer.
Yeah, it's like trying to sell a car that's a lemon.
Right. You might be able to find a buyer.
Yeah.
But you're not going to get a good price for it.
And privatization can also lead to job losses.
Right.
Private companies often seek to streamline operations and cut costs.
Right.
Which can result in redundancies.
This is a common concern, particularly in sectors like transportation and utilities, where state-owned enterprises have traditionally been large employers.
Yeah, and there's also a concern that privatization could lead to a reduction in essential services.
Okay.
If a state-owned enterprise is providing a vital service, such as public transportation or healthcare, there's a risk that a private company might prioritize profits over service quality.
Okay, so there's a real fear that privatization could lead to a two-tier system, where those who can afford to pay for premium services get access to higher quality, while those who rely on public services are left with a diminished offering.
Exactly. So as you can see, the decision to privatize is a complex one.
It is.
With potential benefits and drawbacks to consider.
Now,
it's not a one-size-fits-all solution.
Right.
And each case needs to be carefully evaluated, taking into account the specific circumstances.
Now let's move on to a concept that goes beyond the purely financial aspects of economics. And delves into the broader impact of economic activity on society, social costs, and social benefits.
It's important to remember that market prices don't always reflect the full costs and benefits of a particular activity.
So when we talk about the private cost of something, we're just looking at the costs incurred by the individual or the firm engaging in that activity.
Exactly.
For example, the private cost of driving a car includes things like the price of fuel insurance and maintenance.
The social cost of driving includes those private costs, plus the broader impacts on society, like air pollution, traffic congestion, noise pollution.
Those costs are borne by everyone, not just the individual driver.
Exactly.
And the same goes for social benefits. A private benefit is the benefit that accrues directly to the individual or the firm,
Right.
while a social benefit is a benefit that accrues to society as a whole.
For example, the private benefit of getting a college education is the increased earning potential
Okay.
and career opportunities it provides for the individual.
Right.
But the social benefit includes a more educated workforce,
Yeah.
which can lead to greater innovation, economic growth,
Okay.
and a more informed and engaged citizenry.
So when we're making decisions about economic policies or investments, it's crucial to consider not just the private costs and benefits, but also the broader social costs and benefits.
Absolutely. Failing to do so can lead to decisions that might seem economically sound on the surface,
Right.
but ultimately have negative consequences for society as a whole.
Now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's touch briefly on the role of semi-state companies in the Irish economy.
Semi-state companies are businesses that are partially or wholly owned by the government.
Okay.
They play a significant role in providing essential services, managing key infrastructure, and promoting economic development.
Some prominent examples include CIA, which operates public transportation,
Yeah.
the ESB, which provides electricity, Arte, the national broadcaster,
Right.
and Bordbaya, which promotes Irish food and drink.
Semi-state companies often operate in sectors where private investment might be limited,
Okay.
or where there's a strong public interest in ensuring universal access to services, regardless of profitability.
They face unique challenges as they're expected to balance commercial viability with their public service obligations.
They do.
Their performance and governance are also often subject to public scrutiny,
Yeah.
as they're ultimately accountable to the citizens of Ireland.
Absolutely. It's a complex and constantly evolving landscape.
It certainly is.
Yeah.
And with that, we'll wrap up part 1 of our deep dive into the world of fiscal policy.
Stay tuned for part 2, where we'll delve even deeper into the intricacies of government finance and explore how these concepts shape our lives in countless ways.
Okay, see you next time. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of fiscal policy.
In the last part, we explored where the government gets its money.
Right. How it spends it and some of the key tools it uses to steer the economy in the right direction.
We also talked about taxes,
Yes.
the national debt, and privatization.
Big picture issues that can sometimes feel a bit abstract, but have very real consequences for all of us.
Exactly.
And speaking of real consequences,
Okay.
let's talk about the impact of fiscal policy
Okay.
on ordinary citizens.
Yeah, at the end of the day, fiscal policy isn't just about numbers on a spreadsheet.
Right.
It's about people. It's about the services we rely on, the jobs we have, the opportunities we have to build a better future.
Okay, so let's connect the dots. How do those government decisions about taxes and spending actually trickle down and affect our daily lives?
Well, think about the things that matter most to people.
Go.
Healthcare, education, transportation.
Yeah.
Housing, a clean environment. These are all areas that are heavily influenced by fiscal policy.
Take healthcare, for example.
Yeah.
The government's decisions about how much to spend on healthcare, how to fund the system, what services to provide, have a huge impact on our access to quality care, the cost of treatment, even our overall health outcomes.
Absolutely. And the same goes for education.
Right.
The amount of money the government invests in schools, from early childhood education to higher education, affects the quality of teaching, the availability of resources, and ultimately the opportunities available to our children.
And we can't forget about infrastructure.
No, we can't.
Those roads, bridges, public transport systems, broadband networks we rely on every day. Those are all products of government investment, which is directly influenced by fiscal policy.
The quality of our infrastructure affects our commutes, our access to jobs and services, even our ability to stay connected.
It's amazing how interconnected everything is.
It is.
These seemingly abstract decisions made in the halls of government ripple out and shape the very fabric of our lives.
It's true. And it's not just about the things the government provides directly.
Okay.
Fiscal policy also affects the overall health of the economy.
Right.
Which has a huge impact on our job prospects, our incomes, our ability to provide for our families.
A strong economy with low unemployment means more job opportunities, higher wages, a greater sense of security and prosperity.
Exactly. And that's why it's so important for citizens to understand the basics of fiscal policy and engage in the debates surrounding these issues. We have a stake in these decisions, and our voices deserve to be heard.
Now, speaking of debates, one of the most contentious issues surrounding fiscal policy is the role of government intervention in the economy.
Yeah, it's a classic debate that has been raging for centuries. On one hand, you have those who believe that the government should actively intervene in the economy, using its powers to stabilize markets, stimulate growth, and promote social welfare.
This is the Keynesian view, right?
Exactly, named after the famous economist John Maynard Keynes.
Right.
He argued that governments should use fiscal policy, particularly government spending, to counter economic downturns and prevent prolonged recessions.
Okay.
He believed that the government could act as a counter-cyclical force, injecting money into the economy when private spending was weak.
So during a recession, when businesses are hesitant to invest and consumers are cutting back on spending, the government could step in with increased spending on infrastructure projects, for example, to create jobs and boost demand.
That's the idea. This approach gained a lot of traction in the aftermath of the Great Depression when many countries adopted Keynesian policies to try and pull their economies out of the doldrums.
But Keynesian economics isn't without its critics.
No.
What are some of the arguments against a more interventionist approach?
Well, some argue that government intervention can distort markets, create inefficiencies, and stifle innovation. They believe that the private sector is better equipped to allocate resources and drive economic growth.
This is the more free market view, often associated with economists like Milton Friedman.
Exactly. This school of thought emphasizes the importance of low taxes, deregulation, and free trade as the keys to unlocking economic prosperity.
Right.
They argue that government intervention often creates unintended consequences, such as crowding out private investment or creating moral hazard, where individuals or businesses take on more risk because they believe the government will bail them out if things go wrong.
So it's a complex debate with no easy answers.
It is.
It seems like finding the right balance between government intervention and free market principles is key.
It's all about finding the right mix of policies that will promote a stable, growing, and equitable economy.
Now let's shift gears a bit and talk about something dear and dear to all our hearts.
Okay.
Taxes.
Yes, tax.
After all, they're the lifeblood of the government and the primary way it funds all those essential services and programs we've been discussing.
Taxes are a fascinating and often controversial topic.
They are.
They're essential for funding the things we value as a society.
Right.
But they can also be a source of frustration and resentment, especially if people feel they're not getting their money's worth or that the system is unfair.
I think everyone has a love-hate relationship with taxes.
Yeah, probably.
We appreciate the things they fund, but we don't always love paying them.
I understand that.
But before we dive into the various types of taxes and their pros and cons, let's explore some fundamental principles of taxation.
That's a great idea. Understanding these principles can help us evaluate the fairness and effectiveness of different tax systems and engage in more informed discussions about tax policy.
Okay, so what are some of the key principles that should guide a good tax system?
Well, one of the most important principles is equity.
Okay.
A fair tax system should distribute the burden of taxation fairly among citizens, based on their ability to pay.
This is the idea behind progressive taxation, where those who earn more pay a higher percentage of their income in taxes.
Exactly. The principle of equity also suggests that those who benefit most from government services and programs should contribute more to their funding.
So, for example, those who use public transportation more frequently might pay a higher proportion of their income in taxes that fund public transportation systems.
That's the idea. Another important principle is efficiency.
Okay.
An efficient tax system should minimize the costs of collecting taxes.
Okay.
And avoid creating unnecessary distortions in the economy.
So we don't want a system that's so complex and burdensome that it discourages work investment or economic activity.
Right. An efficient tax system should also be transparent and predictable.
Okay.
Taxpayers should be able to understand how the system works, how their taxes are calculated, and what their tax liability is likely to be.
This helps to build trust in the system.
It does.
And encourages compliance.
Absolutely. And finally, a good tax system should be convenient. Taxes should be collected in a way that is easy and straightforward for taxpayers.
Right. Nobody wants to spend hours filling out complicated tax forms or standing in long queues to pay their taxes.
A convenient system promotes compliance and reduces administrative burdens.
Okay. Now, keeping these principles in mind, let's explore the different types of taxes that governments typically use to raise revenue.
Sure. On the direct tax side, we have income tax, which is the most common type of tax in most developed countries.
Right.
This is the tax that's deducted from your paycheck or levied on your business profits.
And the rate of income tax can vary depending on your income level, right?
It can, with higher earners typically paying a higher percentage.
Okay.
This is where the concept of progressive taxation comes into play.
Right. Then you have property taxes.
Yes.
Which are levied on the value of real estate, such as homes and land.
Property taxes are a major source of revenue for local governments, funding things like schools, roads, and other local services.
And then there are capital gains taxes,
Yeah.
which are levied on profits from the sale of assets, such as stocks, bonds, or real estate.
These taxes can be a bit controversial, as some argue they discourage investment and entrepreneurship.
Right. And inheritance taxes, also known as estate taxes,
Yeah.
are levied on the transfer of wealth upon death. These taxes are often seen as a way to redistribute wealth and prevent the concentration of wealth in a small number of hands.
They can also be quite complex and emotionally charged, especially when it comes to family businesses or farms that have been passed down through generations.
Right. And on the indirect tax side, we have value-added tax, VAT, which is a consumption tax that's added to the price of goods and services at each stage of production.
This is the tax that always seems to sneak up on you at the checkout counter.
Right. VAT is a major source of revenue for many governments, as it's relatively easy to collect and generates a steady stream of income. But it can also be regressive, as lower-income households tend to spend a larger proportion of their income on goods and services that are subject to VAT.
Then you have excise duties, which are levied on specific goods, such as alcohol, tobacco, and fuel.
Right.
These taxes are often justified on the grounds that they discourage the consumption of harmful products or help to internalize the costs of activities that have negative externalities, such as pollution.
And tariffs, as we mentioned earlier, are taxes on imported goods, which can be used to protect domestic industries from foreign competition.
So as you can see, there's a whole range of taxes that governments can use to raise revenue, each with its own unique characteristics, advantages, and disadvantages.
Right. Choosing the right mix of taxes is a crucial aspect of fiscal policy.
It is.
And it's a decision that should be guided by principles of fairness, efficiency, transparency, and convenience.
Absolutely. Now let's zoom out a bit and look at the bigger picture of how fiscal policy interacts with the overall economy.
One of the key concepts to understand is the relationship between fiscal policy and economic growth.
Governments can use fiscal policy to try and influence the pace of economic growth, either stimulating it during a downturn or cooling it down during a period of rapid expansion.
So during a recession, the government might implement expansionary fiscal policies, such as increasing spending or cutting taxes to try and boost demand and create jobs.
Exactly. And during a boom, when the economy is overheating and inflation is rising, the government might implement contractionary fiscal policies, such as reducing spending or raising taxes to try and cool things down and prevent a bubble from forming.
But it's not always that straightforward, is it?
No, it's not. There are lags between implementing a policy and seeing its effects.
Right.
And it can be difficult to predict how individuals and businesses will respond to changes in taxes and spending.
And the effectiveness of fiscal policy can also be influenced by factors outside of the government's control. Such as global economic conditions or changes in consumer confidence.
That's right. It's a complex and dynamic system, and policymakers have to constantly monitor the situation and adjust their approach as needed.
Okay, now another key concept to understand is the relationship between fiscal policy and the national debt. As we discussed earlier, when the government runs a budget deficit, it has to borrow money to cover the shortfall, which adds to the national debt.
And if those deficits persist over time, the national debt can grow to unsustainable levels, burdening future generations with interest payments and limiting the government's ability to invest in essential services and programs.
So managing the national debt is a crucial aspect of responsible fiscal policy.
It is.
But it's not always easy to strike the right balance between using borrowing to stimulate the economy and keeping debt levels under control.
It's a constant balancing act, and the decisions policymakers make in this area can have profound consequences for the long-term health of the economy and the well-being of future generations.
Okay, now, before we wrap up this part of our deep dive, let's touch briefly on the concept of social responsibility. In the context of fiscal policy.
It's important to remember that fiscal policy isn't just about economics, it's also about values. The decisions governments make about how to raise and spend money reflect their priorities and their vision for society.
So a government that prioritizes social welfare might choose to invest more heavily in programs like healthcare, education, and Social Security, even if it means running higher deficits or increasing taxes.
Exactly. And a government that prioritizes environmental sustainability might choose to invest in renewable energy, public transportation, and other initiatives aimed at reducing carbon emissions, even if it means foregoing some short-term economic growth.
So ultimately, fiscal policy is a reflection of our values and our aspirations as a society. It's about making choices that will create a fairer, more prosperous, and more sustainable future for all. Welcome back to our deep dive into the world of fiscal policy.
We've covered a lot of ground.
We have, haven't we? We started by looking at where the government gets its money and how it's spent.
Right. Then we moved on to those all-important taxes.
Yes, everyone's favorite topic.
And we even tackled some pretty big issues.
Yeah, like the national debt and privatization.
It's been quite a journey.
It really has. I hope our listeners are feeling a bit more informed.
Me too. It's easy to feel overwhelmed by all this, but when you break it down, it's actually pretty fascinating.
So as we wrap up our deep dive, what are some of the key takeaways you hope our listeners will remember?
Well, first and foremost, I hope they'll remember that fiscal policy is a really powerful tool that governments can use to shape the economy and society.
It's not just about balancing the books, is it?
No, it's about making choices that reflect our values and our vision for the future.
And there's no one-size-fits-all approach.
Exactly. The best course of action will always depend on the specific circumstances and the potential trade-offs involved.
It's about finding that balance.
It is.
Between stimulating growth, controlling inflation, ensuring fairness, and promoting long-term sustainability.
Yeah, but perhaps most importantly, I hope listeners will come away feeling empowered. Understanding fiscal policy gives you a voice. Right. It allows you to hold your elected officials accountable, advocate for policies that align with your values, and really participate in shaping the future of our country.
That's a great point. I think it's easy to feel overwhelmed by the complexity of these issues.
Yeah.
But knowledge is the antidote to that feeling of helplessness. When we understand the basics, we're better equipped to navigate this world and make informed decisions.
Absolutely. And remember, learning is a lifelong journey.
It is.
Don't stop with this deep dive.
Yeah.
Stay curious, keep asking questions, and continue exploring the fascinating world of fiscal policy.
Well said. And with that, we'll wrap up our deep dive into fiscal policy. We hope you've enjoyed the journey and learned something valuable along the way.
Until next time, stay informed, stay engaged, and keep diving deep.